Hey guys, and welcome to day 19 of Advent. So we are moving right along. We are actually about to get into the New Testament books soon this week as we get ready to talk about the birth of Jesus. But there's still one more big thing I want to hit in the Old Testament, a section that's really close to my heart because there's so many amazing lessons that can be learned from this book of the Bible. And it's the book of Nehemiah. And if you don't know much about this book, basically the background is while the Israelites were pulled away and living in exile, they were gone for so many years, 70 plus years. Some predict maybe even 90, where they were living in foreign cities such as Babylon. And we talked about that in previous videos with Daniel. And so finally, their exile starts to come to an end, and God is allowing them to return in small segments. They don't all get to return at once because they've been spread all over to their holy city, which is Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is so near and dear to the Jewish heart because of many things. If we back up to the Old Testament story of Abraham, when Abraham conquers a people, this is after he's kind of been called by God, he wins a battle basically for his nephew Lot. And he meets a king, Melchizedek, comes out to give Abraham gifts, and Melchizedek is the king of Salem, which later becomes Jerusalem, the seat of this holy people. There's just a really cool history and connection there. And then fast forward, it's also the place where all of the kings of the Jews set up their power and their seat. It's where the temple was built. It's just this place that gave them, it was such a huge part of their identity with God. Just so much of their lives had been there, a common language, a common government, a common people. And as they were scattered all over the world, this place was left in ruins. The city, the temple, so many pieces of the temple had been carried off through conquest, and the walls of the city were absolutely destroyed. And nowadays, we wouldn't think much of walls around a city because we have other ways to protect us. We have airborne, planes and helicopters and jets that can fly out and protect our cities. But back then, a wall was everything. It was the place of protection. It kept a city united and a front against its enemies. And the walls of Jerusalem were crumbling. And so Nehemiah, that's how his book starts. He returns to this city and he goes back, and the first thing he sees is that the walls have fallen apart. And he weeps about this. If you pick up on the first chapter of the book in verse 3, it says, he comes back, he's talking to the people. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. So even the gates are broken. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven, and then I said. And so he goes actually into a long prayer. So he's so sad about this, probably sad, mourning for just the years that have been lost to exile, where the people have been scattered with no place to call home. And now as they return home in these different segments, it's actually rumored that this is not the first group that returned there. They believe that some 90 years before, some others had started returning. And then 30 years before, another segment of Jewish people had returned, all before Nehemiah. And so by the time he gets there, he's like, why has nothing been done about this? All these years you guys have returned and are sitting here, and the city is still in ruins. Don't you care? Don't you care at all about our nation and our image as a nation and our unity and our peace and our defense against our enemies? He's just weeping and praying before God and pouring out his heart. And the thing is, God has given this one man a vision. Because what Israel most lacked right now in this point in time was leadership. Any leaders they once had, any kings had been scattered to the wind, judges were gone. They had been separated, put out in different countries, no place to call home. And even though these people had returned home, they still were not united in their purpose. They needed a man to call them back together, turn their focus on God, and God gave Nehemiah that vision, and he was going to enact it in the rebuilding of the wall, and asking Nehemiah to just start stirring the hearts of the people towards this. And Nehemiah doesn't act rashly. He doesn't just immediately go and do this, right? Like start grabbing stones and trying to fix it. He has to prepare and build up to this. So if you kind of go forward in the chapter, there's some just beautiful lessons in leadership to be learned from Nehemiah. And why is it important, right? Why is it important that Israel would start to come together again if Jesus was coming? Because they needed to turn their eyes back towards God. And without leadership, they were just really wandering like lost sheep. It is so true, as Jesus calls them, those lost sheep. He wants to gather them back together, he says, like a mother hen gathers her chicks. So let's go on to chapter 2. And he's sent back to Jerusalem to work on it. Basically, he gets permission from the king that he's been living in exile with in Babylon to go back to this place. The king asks him why he looks so sad, and he's scared to tell the king, because if you displeased a king back then, you could be executed. But he says, verse 3, I actually love his honesty. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So the king says to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. So he's praying before answering, which is wisdom there. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have the letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, by the temple and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. So he doesn't come empty-handed either. I'm so struck by this passage because Nehemiah is very bold here. He is asking a foreign king, to give him the materials and goods to go rebuild his old home city. Why on earth would a foreign king want to give up goods, materials, permission, all of this stuff to one of his advisors that had been serving him for years? I mean, he could have just said, no, you stay right here. You serve my kingdom and I'm not letting you go do anything for your God. But this shows here that God's hand was behind it and that Nehemiah had prepared an answer and he was expecting abundantly more, right? Sometimes we get a vision of what we think God's going to do, or God calls us to something, and our minds are so small. We ask for the bare minimum. But the Bible shows us again and again that we can pour out our hearts to God and we can ask for more than we would ever imagine, and then God's going to multiply it. Isn't that crazy that if we can just have that little seed of faith like Nehemiah has here, that God, this is so unexpected that this king says, I'm going to pour out resources. I'm going to give you safe passage. You can have this amount of time to go and do this project. And again, he didn't jump in without planning. He had already thought this out. Nehemiah had thought out what he was going to need. So he had that background there, which is also leadership material. And then in the next chapter, the same chapter, but it goes on. He starts leading the people to rebuild the walls. So it says, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, this is verse 12, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. So it talks about he goes by night to survey the damage and really make a plan. Sometimes God may give you a calling. He might have put something on your heart right now, and you may have doubts about it. And I will just say this, be very, very careful who you tell. In a metaphorical way, you may need to go by night and survey what needs to be done. You may need to sit back and think through all that he's calling you to do, because the moment you reveal your dream, your aspiration, your calling, the scoffers will come out. The doubters will come out, and they're going to make you doubt if God called you to it. It's going to put those seeds in your head, and you've got to be strong and sure of what you are set to do. You've got to be strong and sure of what God has called you to do, and be prepared to express that in the daylight. But at night, he was going, he didn't call attention to himself, and there's many reasons for that, right? He also didn't want the enemies of Jerusalem to see that he's starting to rebuild the wall, because when he does that, they're going to be strong again. They're going to be a strong central power, and if enemies got wind of this, they'd start to come out. They would want to hinder this progress, and you may be making steps toward what God is calling you to. Be careful who you tell. Be careful to only let God pour it into your heart right now and find encouragement that you need, okay? Until the time is ready, until he calls you to come out in the day and start rebuilding that wall. Hopefully you understand the metaphor I'm making there. All right, and then they go on and they keep building this wall. And I actually, just for the sake of time, I'd like to make this almost into a 2-part video that I will go into a little bit more tomorrow. But I just want you all to be encouraged today that God, he had a plan, and he works through the most unexpected of us, right? I don't think Nehemiah thought that God would use him in such a way to bring back the focus of a nation. But by him doing this skill set, right? This is something he had a skill and a trade and a calling to do. God is using him to accomplish his purpose. And you may have a specific skill set right now that God is preparing you to do. A trade that he is going to use that you can't even foresee the way he's going to bless others through your life. But I ask today that you trust him and trust that he has and had a plan that's the coming of Jesus that we're getting to. I'm so excited. So come back tomorrow. I'll see you guys for Advent Day 20.